in talking about proteins, I want to go through and talk about some common structures and types of proteins. So proteins are generally classified by their three-dimensional shapes. So if you look at their three-dimensional shape, we can usually break them down into two types of proteins. One are going to be fibrous proteins, and the other type are going to be globular proteins. So fibrous proteins are going to be insoluble in water, and these are ones that are going to serve structural roles primarily. So these are things like the proteins are going to be involved in like cartilage and tendons and things of that nature. So proteins like collagen and keratin. Keratin is one that's found in your hair and fingernails, for instance. All of those things serve structural roles. Whereas globular proteins, these are going to be water-soluble proteins. So these are the ones that are found like inside of your cells or floating in your bloodstream, or like the ones that are inside your red blood cells. So the role of these proteins are typically going to be involved in like enzymatic processes or in transporting molecules. So these types of proteins are all going to be globular proteins. So in looking through these two different types, first I want to talk about some of the fibrous proteins, the structural proteins. So keratins are proteins found in hair, hooves, nails, skin, things like that. So if you were like to rub your fingers together, you would really be rubbing off some keratin protein because it's kind of loosely found associated with your skin. Keratins have these long sections of alpha helical units, and they specifically have a whole lot of alanine and leucine residues found in those alpha helices, and they actually form what we refer to as like a coiled coil. So if you look at hair, for instance, if you look here, it calls this a supercoil, right? So here's a supercoil where you really kind of have these alpha helices wrapped around each other. So this is called like a coiled coil motif, meaning that you have like one coil wrapped around another, and that's what forms kind of the structure of a hair, which gives it this rigid structure. Now notice that if you look at this picture here, right, so here's this coiled coil, and this is just like one of like thousands upon thousands of these coiled coils that come together to form one strand of hair. So this is a very microscopic view of everything, but in general, the alpha keratin itself down here is going to be made up of an alpha helix, and you're going to take multiple of these alpha helices, wrap them around each other to form this coiled coil, and that is what is going to form this supercoil, which is found in your strand of hair. Going back now to the previous slide, collagen requires 3 chains together in a superhelix. Vitamin C helps stabilize these chains in the formation of collagen. So one important thing for vitamin C is to help form these collagen units. That's an important job of vitamin C. So in looking at some other types of proteins, so hemoglobin and myoglobin are going to be globular proteins. So these ones are now globular proteins. All right, so hemoglobin and myoglobin are globular, and they're also called conjugated proteins. So the meaning behind this conjugated proteins is that they have a non-amino acid component to them, right? So in other words, hemoglobin and myoglobin are made up of a whole bunch of amino acids, but they do have a part of them that is non-amino acid. So in the case of hemoglobin and myoglobin, they both have what is referred to as a heme unit, right? So this heme unit is a structure that looks like this. So here's a complicated looking at a heme unit. You can see there's a whole bunch of like organic parts to this. You can see alkenes, right, with the double bonds. If you look over here, you see a CO2H, which is a carboxylic acid. And in the middle of all this, you have an iron. So iron is kind of the central component to this heme unit, which is found in both hemoglobin and myoglobin. And the iron is specifically in the +2 state, right? So if iron goes into the +3 state, that can cause a whole lot of problems in terms of your oxygen transport. So we don't want iron in the +3 state. Iron in the +2 state is able to bind oxygen in the bloodstream and then transport it throughout the body. And what happens is the affinity of the oxygen to that iron changes with pH, and different tissues have different pHs. So whenever hemoglobin picks up oxygen in the lungs, and then it goes out to other tissues. It's more acidic in other tissues, and that slight change of acidity in other tissues causes that oxygen to be released from the hemoglobin and deposited in those other types of tissues. Myoglobin is very similar to hemoglobin, except it stores oxygen. So in other words, the myoglobin has a different quaternary structure than hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has 4 subunits. So hemoglobin has 4 subunits. And that allows it to have that pH sensitivity I just talked about. Myoglobin only has 1 subunit. So because of those difference in the quaternary structure between myoglobin and hemoglobin, that allows hemoglobin to work as a transporter, whereas myoglobin works more as just a storage unit of oxygen. All right, so here's myoglobin in its picture. Here, 153 amino acids, 1 polypeptide chain. You don't need to know that it's 153 amino acids. You should know that it's only 1 polypeptide chain though, right? So know that it's a single subunit. And what I mean by a subunit, it has like 1 polypeptide, 1 N-terminus, C-terminus, 1 unit to it. So here's a picture of myoglobin. You can see the heme group in there with the iron attached to it. That's the one that's kind of in the kind of gold color in the middle there. And then hemoglobin has basically, you can almost think of hemoglobin as 4 myoglobin units all joined together. So the hemoglobin has 4 polypeptide chains. There's 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits. And each of them have their own heme unit. And you can see a heme unit there. You can see a heme unit over there, down there, and over there. So the 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits all come together in a quaternary structure, right? So quaternary structure to form this functional hemoglobin unit. So hemoglobin is a target for carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide poisoning can occur when carbon monoxide binds to your hemoglobin. And the problem here is that if you have hemoglobin, so I'm going to abbreviate hemoglobin as HB down here on the bottom. So hemoglobin can bind oxygen. Hemoglobin can also be bound by carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide binds much better than oxygen. So basically, if carbon monoxide is around, hemoglobin would prefer to bind to it, right? And you can see up here in the slide, it said it binds 200 times more strongly to iron than does O2. So that hemoglobin has an iron in it. That iron will preferentially bind to the carbon monoxide if it's around. Well, if that iron in hemoglobin is bound to carbon monoxide, the oxygen can no longer bind. So this oxygen is just kind of left out, right? And it's not going to attach to hemoglobin anymore because of that. So because of that, hemoglobin is going to carry carbon monoxide all over the place. And the hemoglobin won't let go of that carbon monoxide either, right? It binds too tightly to let go. And what happens is the cells that are expecting to have that oxygen carried to it end up dying from the lack of oxygen. When our cells die, we die, and eventually you can die from carbon monoxide poisoning due to oxygen starvation because that oxygen is not going to be carried around anymore. Also related to hemoglobin and the ability to transport oxygen is sickle cell disease. So sickle cell anemia is a disease where you have a single amino acid kind of changed in 2 of the hemoglobin subunits. So basically, one of the subunits that is found in hemoglobin has a mutation, and right, each subunit is present 2 times. So you have a mutation in that subunit in hemoglobin, and that single amino acid being mutated, and we'll talk a little bit more about genetic diseases and mutations in the last chapter, in chapter 17. This mutation causes the red blood cells to take on a different shape. So that mutated hemoglobin causes these elongated and crescent shaped red blood cells, which is referred to as the sickle cell shape. And what happens is whenever these red blood cells that are no longer these nice round spherical shapes go through your bloodstream, right? So going through your capillaries, the round ones go through without a problem. But whenever you have something round going through, it can go through pretty easily. But now that you have something that kind of has like a sickle shape like this, think of it, it's almost like a boomerang going through there that has these pointy ends to it. Well, whenever these things bump up against your capillaries, it hurts. And that pain leads to inflammation, which eventually can lead to organ damage, and people can die from this sickle cell anemia due to this single amino acid mutation in the hemoglobin.